What's going on, AP World Historians? This is your teacher, Ben Osborne here. No matter where you're coming from, I'll be your teacher, no matter what. That's just the kind of guy I am. We're taking a look today for AP World History. We got East Asia. This is Unit 1. Specifically, it is going to be Time Period 1 as well. So Unit 1, TP1. This is going to be the first section, kind of 1.1, where it talks a bit about East Asia. And particularly, we're looking at social, political, things like that. And the primary group we're talking about here is the Song Dynasty, which is well known as being one of the most important culturally, in a lot of ways economically, but it's not really like the big one when it comes to military or importance and things like that. So let's check it out, okay? So for looking here at East Asia. Now, if you remember, prior to the Song Dynasty, we're going to have mostly the Tang Dynasty is the dynasty immediately before this. The Tang Dynasty is going to collapse in around, it's the early 900s, and then about 50 years later, then we're going to have the rise of the Song. One of the things that's really important about that collapse and rise is going to be the idea that China is one country, is going to survive over that time period. So prior to this, there had been lots of sort of like big dynasties, then everything collapses again, then big dynasties, and everything collapses again. And the idea of sort of China, like China that we think of it today, is something that really forms later on during this time period between the Tang and the Song. There was no sort of question about like, was China going to be reunited? It was just a question of when. So we have this period where we go from a divided China perhaps being something that could happen to it being essentially an aberration in Chinese history. So now it's just like, even if it falls apart for a while, everyone just expects eventually that it will come back together. China is a thing at this point. Okay, so let's check out here a little bit about East Asia for the government. Now, obviously, East Asia does not just include China. We're also going to be including here the Japanese as well as the Koreans. There's also, just because this section here has a little bit about it, we also have Vietnam. Don't forget, though, that Vietnam is mostly going to be Southeast Asia, so not exactly within our time period here. But because China interacts with them in so many ways, they kind of get lumped in sometimes in with China. Like, there's a lot of invasions by the Chinese into northern Vietnam. There's a lot of influence over Vietnam from the Chinese in particular. So taking a look here, so the Song Dynasty again is going to replace the Song in about 960. There's an invasion of nomadic peoples eventually that will force them south. So what happens basically is that they're just not that strong, and there are a couple of different dynasties that are going to be north of them, particularly one that's led by a group of people called the Jurchen. The Jurchen will end up founding the Jin Dynasty, which will be sort of northern China, and eventually the Song will really tick off the northern, they will tick off the Jurchens and the Jin Dynasty, and that dynasty will invade. So the Song had actually sort of negotiated with other groups. They had sort of sided with the Jurchen. They were trying their best to sort of play each other off of them, but it doesn't work out very well for them. And so eventually we end up having this invasion. The Jin Dynasty will take control of the capital of Kaifeng, the northern capital of the Song Dynasty, and then they will set up their own court at modern-day Beijing, though it was called something different back then. And so we end up having this time period called the Northern Song and the Southern Song, depending on what is the capital and sort of where it is. The Southern Song is definitely a rump state. It is a smaller, less important affair, but that doesn't mean that it's not important. Like, it has a lot of really important things that come with it as well. So the Song Dynasty is going to do a couple different things. They're going to expand the imperial bureaucracy in particular. So the bureaucracy had been created under earlier emperors. It had reached sort of a height within the Han and the Tang Dynasty. But gradually over time, it had come into a couple different things. One is that it focused almost exclusively on the Confucian classics. And the other thing that it did is that it mostly allowed only certain people who could study those to be able to rise into that position. And they had to study for the civil service exam. So by the time of the Song Dynasty, then, this idea of a civil service exam based upon the Confucian classics is something that is just firmly placed into the minds and ideas of people of China. So Emperor Taizu then is going to expand the opportunities available to the poor in the civil service. We go from, at one point in prior times, during like the Tang Dynasty, you might have 10 people who would achieve the highest rank of Jinshi, to the point where you have like 140 people who are doing the same thing. it got so bad that they actually ended up having way too many people in the higher ranks. So you would end up seeing people sort of retire for a few years and then come back. They would sort of move people around a little bit if they needed to in order to try to make it useful for them. It's not exactly like a dirt poor person could become the highest rank of the civil service. I mean, that's still not really going to happen. Your average street sweeper or whatever was not going to be able to understand the Confucian classics well enough in order for them to be able to pass the tests. But more people who are on the lower levels of society were going to be able to be involved because the whole thing was expanded in general. So having more people being able to do that, and also having more people who are capable of achieving the tests, means that you're going to have more people. So the availability of the civil service is going to be much bigger. You have more people going into it over time. This extra bureaucracy size, though, did hurt the economy a bit of the song. You ended up needing to find places or lands for everybody, and that could sometimes be a little difficult. Let me move my big old head here a little bit. So you can see a little bit more about Japan. So Japan, on the other hand, then, is going to be a bit more feudalistic like Europe. So they do technically have an emperor, but that emperor is not a reigning emperor. That emperor is not in control of day-to-day things that are going on. Instead, you end up having this family that's going to control it, and that family will change over time. The way that they believed was that the emperor was the descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, and so Amaterasu created the entire islands, and in the process of doing so, the emperors are therefore going to be her sons or her descendants. So the emperors were literally gods essentially. So the logic here was that why would you have a god running day-to-day stuff? That's all icky, gross, politics stuff. Who needs to do that? So instead, you would have these families that would take control and let the emperor sort of just write poetry all day and stuff like that instead. So that's exactly what was going on in this period. Now, so there was a family, depending on what time period you're talking. Around this period, we're talking probably the Fujiwara family, but you're going to have others as well. Eventually, you'll end up having the Tokugawa, which may be a name you're familiar with, but that won't be for quite a while. But these people who were in charge, they were called daimyo. They're going to be the kind of major governors or leaders of this family, and they're going to have a lot more power and control. Okay, but otherwise it's going to be similar. You're going to have daimyo who are like dukes or counts or whatever, and they will control certain areas, and people will be under their authority. One thing also in this time period is the samurai, which a lot of you probably think are really cool. Bushido was the code of samurai behavior that was designed to help keep them, honorable and things like that. Now, one thing that's different about Korea, they have some similarities here, like, for example, Confucianism and the government bureaucracy. But one thing about Korea is that they had a focus on the aristocracy. So whereas in China there were aristocracy or aristocratic peoples, the emperor really tried to stop them from being in a lot of power. The idea being that, if you really only have one of two things, you're going to have decentralized control into the aristocracy, or you're going to have the emperor in centralized control. The Koreans split the difference a little bit and had the aristocracy be pretty powerful. So that's going to lead to a much less open civil service, but otherwise quite similar in a lot of ways for their government. The Vietnamese also had similar influences, but of course, as I mentioned, as the Chinese invaded them, they would fight pretty brutally back against them. All right. A couple of images here for you to talk about. So this guy over here on the on the left is going to be your friend and mine, Emperor Taizu. This is a very traditional portrait kind of painting for him. I'm not really sure what's going on with his head thing there. That's pretty astonishing to be able to keep that thing going like that, but it's pretty sweet. Right up above me here is going to be a map of the Southern Song. In this case, it's spelled slightly differently. Don't forget that translating Chinese characters to English is nearly impossible. So we have a couple of different ways that we can do that. And so you'll see pronunciations, well, not pronunciations, but you'll see spellings in English a little bit different than you would see them otherwise. So in this case, we have a U. Traditionally, there's two types of systems to bring over Chinese to English. One is called Wade Giles, which is the older style, and the other is called Pinyin, which is the more modern style. So in China proper, the People's Republic of China, they use Pinyin, and in Taiwan, they will use Wade Giles, but mainly because of when they adopted those systems. But they can be somewhat different from each other. In this case, though, so we have the song, and you can see here this let's go a little farther up till my finger disappears. There it goes. Okay, well anyway, sort of right above me here is going to be Kaifeng, and then Hangzhou, which is right where my finger is here. These are the two capitals of the dynasty. Kaifeng is going to be the northern Song dynasty. It's going to be their capital, and then the southern Song dynasty is going to be Hangzhou there. And you can see just how much territory they lose in this invasion that takes place, and how much weaker they are as a result of that division into the northern and the southern Song. So that area up there where Kaifeng is, again, that's going to be where the Jurchen are. All right. Let's take a look here at economics in East Asia. This is particularly heavy on the Chinese. So the Chinese Tang Dynasty will fall and make way for the Song, but a lot of those economic improvements the Song did really helped the Tang did are really going to help out the economy of the Song. So the Grand Canal is a big example here. The Grand Canal was a waterway that connected the two different rivers of China. So not only could you go east-west on the rivers, you could go north-south on the rivers as well through the Grand Canal. Very, very important. We're also going to see a number of really cool inventions, such as gunpowder will be invented in this period. We also have some amazing new agricultural developments, such as champa rice. It's a particular style of rice that grows very well, and you can basically, I'm pretty sure the reason it's so important is that you're able to double crop it during the course of the year. We also have plows, new types of plows that are being developed, new irrigation techniques, things like that. And as a result of that, we're going to have huge increases in food production. And that's going to increase the Song population. The more food, more security people have, the more that they are going to have larger families. And so that is going to lead to more and more people. I'll show you a graph in a second about that that'll show just how much we're talking about. One other thing that's really fascinating about the Song is that they undergo this they almost have this like industrial revolution. It's super wild. So use of coal, they're going to be able to do better coal mining techniques is going to lead to better iron techniques as well. And the invention of steel. Now, steel is difficult to produce even still. So while they may understand the concept of it, they may be able to make it, right? It's not firm and easy to do. Like there's a lot of different things to do, but they do have some of it, a little bit of it. It's also very expensive, obviously. They're also going to undergo an early form of industrialization. That's going to emphasize sort of work in homes instead of factories. When we get to the Industrial Revolution later, you're going to find out more about how the Industrial Revolution made a shift of work from people working at home into the factories. We don't see that here for a couple of different reasons. There's a lot of historians who kind of almost say that they almost underwent a sort of industrial revolution. And there's questions like why? Why did they not actually go that extra step and have it? And there's a lot of like cultural and economic and other factors. I mean, it's everything from like they had a lot of pressure from external forces that the Europeans didn't have, like the Jurchen or the Mongols. There's questions about like philosophies, like Confucianism didn't really like, it mostly favored farmers. It doesn't really like people who create things necessarily. Artisans and like merchants and stuff. So that was difficult. They didn't have maybe quite the environmental things that they needed, etc. So there's a lot of reasons why, but it's kind of a cool what if kind of situation. We're also going to see porcelain and silk is going to be developed here and used and sold as trading. Use of compasses and paper maps allowed for more trading. So they're going to not only have more items, we're going to be able to move those items around. They're also going to change from using labor taxes to more money taxes instead. So instead of saying you have to work for 3 days today, we're going to say instead, oh, you need to just pay us some money. And that's going to help improve public works in a lot of ways. The Song are also going to force tribute on some of the states that surround them. So, for example, the Tangut and a few other are going to do that. The Jurchen, they're obviously going to pay off because they're scared of. But still. All right. So check out this. First off, look at me. I'm in a bowl of rice. I'm going to grab some, take a bite. So this is champa rice, or the closest I can get to it. I'm not actually 100% sure if that's a picture of champa rice, but it's rice. So again, the big factor here was that it grew so well, and you could basically double crop it, and it allowed for incredible amounts of production, which was very, very beneficial to people having children, etc. If you take a look here at this little image here, you can see the increase over time of the population. So for example, down here in 950, this is about the collapse of the Tang Dynasty and the rise of the Sung Dynasty. You can see that it's only about 20 million or so people who are living there. And so during the course of the next, oh my gosh, what is that, 50 years or so, you're going to have an absolutely enormous increase in the amount of people who are living in China. Now, some of that, I mean, there's little bits of that, like what is China? You know, there's some kind of questions about exactly what this graph means, but the point is still made that you have this huge increase. We have a little bit of a collapse here of people from that initial invasion, but even still, they're still going to increase the amount of population just because they have such a productive agricultural economy and everything's working out really well for them. All right, let's take a look at some social questions here for us. So urban areas are going to grow rapidly under the Song dynasty. This is going to lead to a realignment away from peasant areas. So this is a unique situation in world history. They are never going to reach the same amount of urbanization that we have, for example. Like we're a good 70% or 80% or 90% or whatever. But the Song dynasty reached about 10% urban population, which for the time period is enormous. That's so many people living in those areas. This led to a realignment away from peasant areas. The scholar gentry were those who had passed the exams and become officials, but their power was due to their positions. But they often own land as well, so having this land that's out there for them to work on is going to be sort of interesting, and they can kind of push around those peasants and things that they wanted to. Now, these scholar gentry are going to differ a bit from standard gentry. The standard gentry are sort of born into their positions, but the scholar gentry, or genshi, are going to be able to be granted land on the basis of their service to the state. So that's kind of unique and different. Another example here, another important thing here is Confucianism. We'll talk more about that and Neo-Confucianism in just a second. If you don't know much about Confucianism, the essentials here are that Confucius was a scholar who was the creator. Well, he would argue he wasn't the creator of these ideas of Confucianism. He would argue that he essentially took the wisdom of the ancients and sort of put it all together and created it on and sort of like assembled it together into its own thing. He was not a prophet. He didn't speak for God. He was basically just a guy who had who had really good philosophies. Now, he doesn't deny the afterlife. He doesn't deny religiosity. He thinks it's very important, actually. But he's asked the question often about God, and he's like, don't worry about it. What's important is what's going on right here. Like, that's what really matters here. Confucianism, at its very basics, is basically the idea that you should have a societal structure and that there should be sort of relationships between different people in those structures. So, like if you're a father, you need to help your son out, or your daughter out. And conversely, the son should be a good son to the father, and so forth. So we have these different relationships that are binding. Everything from family life all the way up to, say, the emperor is going to also have like relationships with their servants and subjects, and the subjects should be good to the people at the top as well. As a result of that, then you can see it's a bit patriarchal, and the Song dynasty will expand this. So again, the idea is very male dominated. There's no real like discussion about women here. Women again should be subservient to men, and so that's why they had that. Now, during this period, though, we're going to see a big change. In the Tang Dynasty, women had gotten a bit more rights over time, so because of the influence of Buddhism. And we will have some examples in the Song Dynasty of expanding rights for women, such as new property kind of rights that they have. But we're also going to see kind of a reversal of this in things like polygyny and foot binding. So polygyny is having more than one wife, which became much more acceptable in this period, which debatably decreased the influence of women. And also this practice called foot binding. Now, I'm going to talk about it now. I have some pictures to show you, but, kind of trigger warning, they're kind of gross. So foot binding is a process whereby you take a person's foot, well, it should be a woman's foot, honestly. It's a woman's foot is what foot binding is about. No men did this. And essentially, over the course of their childhood, you're going to slowly fold the toes up until basically you have sort of this foot that sort of looks like this. Like the big toe is going to be out in the front, and then you're going to have the feet that are kind of curled underneath on the bottom. The purpose of this, in a sense, was to show off your power and prestige. If your wife had feet like that, it meant that they couldn't be, out in the fields doing stuff. Like, it's essentially very similar to sort of like European ideals of the Renaissance, of sort of like women being on the larger side because they had the money to be able to eat, or other things like that. I would say, that foot binding is definitely something that's pretty rough. A lot of women did support this, or they chose to do this for various reasons. So it's difficult to wade into this, especially as a man. But we have lots of examples of unusual practices towards attractiveness throughout our lives, and today as well. There's lots of practices that people do that are probably mysterious to people in the future as well. But this one is a particularly interesting one for its kind of crippling, essentially, of women. All right, one other thing, too, here. Japan and Korea had aristocratic classes with lots of power. We talked about that before. Vietnam was a little bit different as well. So in China, they typically had extended families. It would be you and your kids. It would also be your parents, maybe, all living under one roof. The Vietnamese instead are going to have more like nuclear families. So it's going to be mom, dad, and kids, and then parents live separately or some other place. And women also had a lot more freedom and influence in Vietnamese society than you would find in Chinese society. So this next slide does have pictures of foot binding. So if this is not something you really want to look at, you can simply fast forward or kind of move on beyond it a little bit. But check it out. So this is a X-ray. You can see here the X-ray of what's going on. And the same thing also up here, you can see sort of like a drawing of sort of what the foot would look like. Foot binding was practiced up until sort of about 1900 or so. So there are some people who are still alive, people in rural areas who still practiced it up until, 20s, 30s, 40s. The communists actually got rid of it. They really didn't like this. They felt it was a part of the old ways. So you would very rarely, I don't know that anybody does this anymore at all. I'm sure there's somebody somewhere, but generally speaking, you're just not going to see this anymore. But the idea was that it was sort of beautiful. Like the idea is that it's these little tiny dainty feet. It was even sort of like sexually attractive for people. And so you would put on these little shoes and stuff like that. And mostly if you wanted to walk around, you had to use canes in order to be able to go anywhere. All right. Let's take a look here at intellectual and cultural. Okay, so the Song were known very much for their intellectual and cultural advancements. Paper and woodblock printing were big things that they would use. This increased the books available, and more people were literate than before. So woodblock printing is where you take a big sort of slab of wood, you carve it out to be the different images you need, you ink it up, and then you stamp it, basically. Woodblock printing doesn't last that long. Like the wood blocks kind of like split and stuff over time, but they do last longer than doing them by hand. So you could make a woodblock and print out, I don't know, I'm just making numbers up, 20, 100, handbills or whatever until you need a new one. But that's 20 or 100 more than you would have prior to that. So you have a lot more people using a lot more things and being able to read a whole lot more. Another thing about this time period, too, is religious diversity was a bit more common. So we're going to see more people who are Buddhists, Taoists, Confucians. We also see Manichaeist Christian or Manichaeism, and also Nestorian Christians and others are going to be coming to China. But what's interesting is that these religions are going to sort of mix and mingle with each other a little bit. So the problem then for Confucians, like they're sort of the largest of these philosophies / religions, but the problems for Confucians was that, if you have a ghost in your barn, Confucianism doesn't really have a whole lot to help you with that, right? Like people often turn to religion for the need of solving problems or to, make prayers about impossible situations. Well, you got a ghost in your barn, Confucianism ain't going to help you a whole lot. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to turn to the Taoists or to the Buddhists. So Confucianists saw their religion sort of like fading a bit over time. And so in response to that, then they start to kind of adopt some of the other ideas into it. So Neo-Confucianism becomes more popular. Now, we don't need to get into the weeds on what Neo versus other Confucianism is. There's scholars who study this for decades. The point of it, though, is that Confucianism sees a bit of a change or a modification. Now, Neo-Confucianists actually go back all the way to Confucius. A couple of his students actually come up with these concepts, but they don't become popular until later when people start studying them a bit more. But in the case of Neo-Confucianism, then you're going to see a little bit of a combination of these other things and some changes, but it's inherently very China-centered and very China-focused. And so what we end up with is these kind of interesting images, like the one that's right here behind me. Let me see if I can get my picture right. So this picture here behind me is going to be the three great sages here hanging around this little jug, I guess. I don't know. So you're going to end up having Confucius. You're going to have Lao Tzu, who is the creator of Taoism, as well as the Buddha, and they're all sort of hanging out together. And so the idea that you could be all three of these, or that all three of them could be correct, was not something that was unusual. Neo-Confucianism, for example, adopts a couple different ideas of Buddhism over time. So this Neo-Confucianism will be the dominant form of Confucianism until about 1905. It really did sort of reject this mysticism kind of concepts, but incorporates a lot of values of Buddhism and Taoism. All right, folks, that's what we got for there. Hopefully that helped to clarify a little bit about East Asia in this time period. Hopefully helped you understand a little bit more about the Song dynasty. Give me them likes, give me them subs if you want to. It doesn't really matter, but it'd be cool if I had a bunch of those. And look forward to seeing you next time around, okay? Thanks so much for watching. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.